Good morning and welcome to the first episode of the Suppress Herald podcast. And I'm sure the first question people will have is what's that all about? And this is about local media, local newspapers, and I think a good name for them is Suppress Herald. We have locally here, I live in Maine, and our local newspaper is the Portland Press Herald, and the Portland Suppress Herald is a better name. And basically, what we're going to do with this podcast is weekly, once a week, do a summary of everything that happened in the newspaper the previous week. I've been doing this, looking at this for a long time. One of the exercises that I undertook, just a little background, I wouldn't even pay for this newspaper myself. I had my mother-in-law living with my wife and I, and during that time, we had to get the paper for my mother-in-law because she really liked to see the paper and read up on things. And so we did keep that subscription up, and I started looking at it, and I started realizing how biased it was. I think I've known the papers are biased my whole life. My father, I grew up in upstate New York. Our local newspaper in Syracuse, New York, was extremely biased. My father used to raise that issue all the time. So this is nothing new. I think a lot of people are fully aware that they're not getting a real even slant on news in their local newspapers, but I think that it's something that's very overlooked. And I think we really have to be aware of it. It's a situation where, these newspapers are like a daily thing for an awful lot of people, and they just soak it up and they never really question it. And what I'm seeing is a really big impact. As we say, politics is local. And I'd like to make the point that so is propaganda. It starts here. Most national media that are analyzing the media bias, talking about network television and cable television and the Washington Post and the New York Times, and everybody pretty much acknowledges that they have a serious slant. But I think the real problem is that it starts locally. It starts with our local newspapers, and every day people read them, pick them up, go through it. And it's not all just what they're reading, it's what they're not reading. That's the suppressed part. They don't talk about other sides of any issue. And I think that what we're going to do with this podcast over the next coming weeks is we're going to talk about those specifics. What is in the newspaper, and I'll point out what isn't. One of the things that I did, a little exercise I did for a full year from February 2022 until February of 2023, I just opened the paper, and it's 6 days a week locally. They don't have Monday because, like all newspapers, they're hurting. And I'm going to talk about what's happening with local newspapers being taken over by billionaires now. We're going to come to that very shortly. But with 6 days a week, what I would do is open up the editorial page and I'd review it, and I'd go through and I'd say, okay, what's liberal, what's conservative, and what's neutral on the editorials. One thing I didn't do, and there's no need to, is the cartoon section in the editorial page. It's pretty much all liberal. There's maybe one out of 6 or 7, which is consistent with the slant on the editorial page. And what I found at the end of that year was that 52% of all of the editorial that it got in were liberal. Less than 10% were conservative. So 5 times as many liberal letters got published as conservative letters. And then the rest, the other 40%, or a little over 40%, was just neutral. People talking about how some so-and-so did a great thing, or this organization is great, or some of the more neutral subjects that come up on a local newspaper. And it's subjective. There's no question. Basically, here in Maine, we had over that period a major After Roe v. Wade was thrown out by the Supreme Court, we had a major push to liberalize even further our already legal abortion laws. So pretty much abortion on demand right up till birth was what they were advocating for, and it's what they passed in the legislature in Maine. So when you look at that, probably 5-1 pro-abortion versus against abortion or limiting abortion. So that was very consistent. So you've got a situation where if you try to write an editorial letter to the editor and get it published in the paper, if you're a conservative view, you have about 1 in 5 chance of getting yours published as opposed to a liberal view. And that's pretty frustrating. I've written letters to the editor and I never got anywhere. I have gotten a couple published over the years, but I've also gotten pushback, and they sent me back a letter and said, "Oh, you were few words too many," and I'd edit it and send it back, and it never got in. Basically, if you write a good, well-written letter with a conservative view, it never is going to make it. They'll put in the extreme, rant from a conservative to try and make conservatives look bad, but a well-written, well-spoken letter isn't going to make it. And that's just a fact. I actually had an exchange with the editorial director or editor, person that screens those letters, and raised the issue that, wasn't getting published. And she sent me back a letter or an email. It was an email exchange. She sent it back and said, "Hey, just, we are happy to publish letters." And I said, "Well, I actually did a review, and I told her about my study and said that 5 times as many liberal as conservative letters to the editor get published." She said, "Gee, nobody's ever actually checked that on us." She was surprised. Of course she was. They're in a position to manage the message in a big way in these local newspapers. Again, politics is local, and so is propaganda. So I had the idea, if I can't write letters and get them published, and neither can anybody in the more, call it the right side of things, more conservative approach to things, a podcast is a way to go. And I'll tell you what, it's amazing. I have this every day. I get a newspaper at the end of the driveway, and it gives, there's content for a podcast that's infinite. They just do the same thing over and over, leaving out the other side of the story, printing stuff that's already been, if you look at data, if you look at statistics, if you look at the reality of the situation, this stuff has already been debunked, but they just keep doing it. A perfect historical example is look at the Trump-Russia collusion story. They printed that ad nauseum for months and months, years, literally, that stuff went on. Was there ever a page that said, "Hey, we're sorry that whole hoax that we wrote all these articles, thousands of column inches of stories about, turns out to be nothing but a false narrative, a hoax"? Never heard about that. And this is just a regular situation. But we're going to break down the local newspapers, look at this from a local perspective, and I think you'll find it interesting. One very interesting development here in Maine with the newspapers, and this is happening across the country, is that recently the newspapers here, and this is virtually the entire newspaper network of the entire state of Maine, was all owned by one person in Maine, Reed Brower. He bought that from the previous owner, was our U.S. Representative Shelley Pingree, who is a Democrat and part of the Progressive Party, Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives. So extreme liberal. her husband bought the newspapers. For a while there, it was nicknamed the Pingree Press Herald. And as you might imagine, he was a progressive advocate and activist. He was a billionaire. I think he was a George Soros wannabe, George Soros mini me. He bought the papers. I think he bought them for $1 and took over the debt. Held it for, I think, a couple of years or probably longer. Sold it to Reed Brower, who was a printing entrepreneur and businessman in Maine. He then bought another newspaper, probably the second largest newspaper in Maine, and now under one umbrella is virtually the entire everything from the Portland Press Herald, which is the main newspaper in Maine, to local weekly free the Forecaster, which is in the grocery store and on the shelves at the liquor store, and you can buy it or pick it up. It's a free weekly newspaper owned by the same people. And the people that bought the newspaper recently, when Reed Brower put the paper up for sale, it was really a thing to see. The liberals in the state were alarmed. Oh my word, our newspaper that we control the message on is for sale. And a local group jumped in, including a gentleman named Bill Nemitz, who used to be an editorial writer, extremely liberal editorial writer, extremely liberal views, jumped in, formed an organization, and tried to raise money to buy those newspapers. That was a abject failure. They were trying to raise, I believe it was $8 million. They raised less than $1 million. But lo and behold, who did step in and buy all of the papers in Maine is an organization called the National Trust for Local News. And they formed the Maine Trust for Local News, which owns all of those Maine newspapers. And they purchased it. We don't know what the price was. Reed Brower sold the paper to the National Trust for Local News. Now, who is the National Trust for Local News? That's a really important question. This organization formed to try and buy up all these local newspapers, and they're successfully doing it. If you go to their website, you can see where they're buying papers all over the country in small towns and cities and starting to consolidate all this news under one umbrella. Let me give you a few of the people that funded, and this is right on their website, the National Trust for Local News. Open Society Foundations. Guess who that is? That's George Soros, or now Alex Soros, his son, who has taken over Open Society Foundations, and the whole George Soros billionaire control of everything we do is the goal. And extremely liberal on that side. Also, the Gates Family Foundation. Bill Gates, a billionaire, is also funding, taking over local newspapers across the country. And the big one, and the person that founded the National Trust for Local News through Democracy Fund, is a guy named Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, another billionaire, and another liberal activist billionaire buying control of people's media. This whole thing is dangerous. And this is happening right under our noses, unless you're paying attention. So what this whole podcast is going to be about is local news, what's happening to it, what they tell you, and especially what they don't tell you. So let's start with today and yesterday. I'll give you a little taste of what kind of things we're going to look at. So here in Maine, we just had a hurricane come up the coast, and it was going to thrash us and destroy everything. And of course, as you might imagine, you talk about a storm coming up into Maine, and obviously that's global warming is going to be top of the list because hurricanes didn't happen before global warming, right? Well, here's the paper from yesterday when the storm was supposed to hit. Our esteemed Governor Mills declared a state of emergency back on, I think, Friday, locked everybody down and basically after federal money and preemptively, state of emergency. Storm's trajectory shifts east, but Mainers prepare for pain. That was yesterday. In other words, it never happened. We never really got much of a storm at all. I actually went to the beach yesterday. The surfers were having an absolute blast. We had some big surf. We had some power outages. We had some trees come down. The Maine, Central Maine Power, and the other power company, Maine Power Company in Maine, warned us that there's a good chance some trees will go down. We've had a very wet summer. Trees' roots are basically wet and not stable. So you get some winds. Some of those trees will be uprooted. Other trees will break and go down. So we had typical for a thunderstorm, series of thunderstorms. You had people with power out. I think it's all been restored today. It was a big nothing burger. But that doesn't stop the local paper from going crazy with it. And you go into the paper, and this is a almost daily thing these days. You see these headlines. Earth just had its warmest August and summer on record, spurring dire warnings. Of course, spurring dire warnings. Global warming. And then you read through it, and they don't tell you that statistically, that's not the warmest on record. It's the warmest since 1940 when they started keeping those temperatures. What they also don't tell you is where they get those temperatures. There are temperature weather stations in cities. Cities have built out. It used to be at the airport outside of the city. Well, the city went out toward that airport, and now it's concrete and pavement everywhere. And so you're going to have a heat sink in that area, and it's going to be warmer. This 1 to 2 degrees that they're talking about can easily be the position, the location of those weather stations. I could go on, and we will talk more about it in this podcast because global warming is one of the biggest scams going on. Not that it's not happening, but they're reasoning for it and thinking that we can fix it. And there are plenty of people that are out there, and I'm going to talk about this in upcoming podcast episodes. There are thousands of scientists stepping up and saying, wait a minute, this is just too much. But you can't let a good storm go to waste. So you had that yesterday. Earth just had its warmest August and summer on record. And then in the local and state section, climate change could bring more storms like Lee to Maine. That was Hurricane Lee that we just had. I've sailed a sailboat 400 or 500 miles offshore and more winds than that had. It was not a devastating storm by any means, but it's enough to get them going. So climate change could bring more storms like Lee to Maine. And then they go on about all the same stuff that's been basically statistically, and I'm talking about data and statistics. Statistically, this stuff has been debunked time and again by real scientists. We are not having more or more powerful hurricanes than we used to. We are not seeing this heat waves and all the rest more than we have. We have records to 1940, but beyond that, we do know that we're just critical heat waves and everything else. So it's really a situation where these papers every day are just hammering this stuff with the same stuff. And most of it, if you drill down and you do your homework, It's been statistically, with data, with real information, real science, a lot of it debunked. And that's a critical thing. So that's what we're going to be doing on this podcast. We're going to be talking about local news. We're going to be talking about, again, things they do tell you that are wrong and things they don't tell you. And that's the real problem with media these days, is they're only telling you one side or they're covering other things up. And when that's become extremely aware, I can tell you there were no articles in the paper locally about Hunter Biden's laptop leading up to the 2020 election. That I can absolutely guarantee that it didn't happen. They bought in, just like the social media sites were coerced into covering that up, not talking about it. Local media is the same. You won't see anything about Biden's current problems, current, you know, there's an inquiry for an impeachment. This newspaper puts it on. If it's in the paper at all, it's on a back page. Trump gets a hangnail, it's on the front page. That's the difference. And so, welcome to the Suppress Herald podcast. This is just a short introduction. We're going to let people know about the podcast. And then on a weekly basis, we're going to break down the news locally, look at what they're doing. And again, politics is local. So is propaganda. Bye for now.